Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. To support the podcast, head over to patreon.com/wellness with Jer. You can sign up for a membership. Benefits for the membership range from getting a shout out on podcast episode or YouTube video, all the way up to getting access to video episodes, ad-free episodes. We're going to work on some virtual meetups with guests from the podcast in the future. So head over to patreon.com/wellness with Jared to support us. You can find a link to our merch store in the show notes, or you can like, subscribe, and share the podcast wherever it is that you're listening. We appreciate all the support and you taking the time to hang out with us and talk about mental health. This week, I am joined by Dr. Gabby Miniscalco. Gabby, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm super stoked looking into your specialties and some of the things that you work with. One of the things I'm really excited to talk about is working with animals. Big pet lover. My dog's in the background while we're recording here. So I'm excited to talk about that and talking about some of the grief around that. You have a lot of interests that I think overlap with mine and also some topics we haven't covered in the podcast yet. So I'm super stoked to jump into it.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised that you brought up the animal part of things first, because that's a newer interest of mine.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's just my personal bias because I love animals too.
Yeah,
Uh,
but since we're kind of talking about it, I do want to say that I did have a rescue pit bull that I trained to be a therapy dog, and he did a few volunteer outings before we realized that his anxiety might be getting the best of him. So we put him on pause.
sure. Yeah, it's such a process. And we can get into that for how that works and the people who take advantage of it by putting a vest on their dog to fly on a plane and all that stuff. But we'll get there. I'm
Okay.
jumping ahead because I like to talk about animals. So I always start every episode just kind of asking, how'd you get into the mental health field? What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, sure. So I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be a psychologist, probably around 8, 9 years old. I was in middle school at the school library requesting books that they've never even heard of, like Sybil, a child called it. So I was really passionate about the mental health field from the very early beginnings. Um, but I think, more than that, I am an immigrant from Poland. So a lot of who I am now, both as an adult and as a professional, has been shaped by my immigration experience.
Mhm. Yeah. And that's one of the topics I'm excited to talk about because that's not a thing I've super covered in the podcast yet. Um, 8-year-old you was interested in these things because you were trying to figure out your own stuff, because you were interested in helping people and trying to understand what was going on for them. What was kind of that, as you look back maybe and reflect on it, what was that part for you like?
Yeah, I mean, I think as therapists, we can probably all agree that we're in the field at least partly to figure ourselves out. My immigration experience and my acculturation to the United States was pretty rocky, as it is for uh, most people switching countries. So I was born in Poland and I moved to the States permanently when I was about 8.5, 9 years old. Um, and very quickly, I discovered that me being Polish would not get me very far. So I realized very quickly that if I wanted to make it, I had to um, I had to conform, and I had to figure out how I can belong and how I can embrace my Americanness ASAP. Um,
Hmm.
so I think with that, as an immigrant, and I'm sure a lot of other immigrants can relate, or children of immigrants, there is this almost unspoken or sometimes spoken rule of like, you're going to make it and you have to make it because there is no other option. Like, we got you here, we sacrificed everything, now it's on you to utilize all of these resources and be successful, make a name for yourself, really um, break out of any generational cycles that have been left for you.
Mm-hmm. Which is like a pretty heavy thing to put on a adolescent who's developing and just figuring out their own like body and brain and all of that stuff. To have this awareness and some of these expectations placed at that age can be a lot to navigate.
Yeah, yeah. So um, I think I also felt like I had to maybe overcompensate for the lack of belonging that I felt, or the lack of like respect that I was given. So what better way to show the world that you belong and you deserve to be here than to become a doctor, right? No one's gonna shit talk you if you're a doctor, or
Sure.
so I was thinking at the time. So I stayed pretty strict with my trajectory, and did high school, college, a bunch of internships during college, and then went straight for my doctorate.
Mm-hmm. To meet those expectations that were placed on you at a young age, right?
To meet those expectations, that's right. And to also feel like I'm American now, right? I made it. I'm a doctor. It's what you wanted me to do. um but I think uh now, as I'm reflecting on my journey and my identity, I'm starting to realize, like, wow, I was chasing this kind of attachment need that we all have, right? Like, fitting in is biological for us. Like, we as humans need to belong because that's how we survive. We're pack animals. We're social creatures, even if sometimes it's really hard to admit that we need other people. But I was so focused on fitting in and belonging and being one with the crowd that now I look back and I'm like, wow, I really kind of lost myself in the process. I abandoned so many parts of my identity, so much of my authenticity, in order to survive, and in order to feel like I made it. And it kind of felt like I was holding my breath for all those years, as I was pursuing my degrees and jumping through all these hoops. Once I made it to the top, I was like, now what?
Yeah.
Uh, no one ever told me what to do after I became a doctor, right? Everything was just kind of go, go, go. But very minimal conversation as to what happens when you get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, the immigration piece is a separate topic. Obviously the Venn diagram overlaps, but like I think with attachment issues, that's kind of one of the things is like there's not ever enough that you're going to do to get those needs met if you're not securely attaching to people who are wanting to securely attach to you back. Like there's no way to fulfill that need without having a healthy attachment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've also done a lot of reflecting and some professional writing about the trauma associated with immigration, and can't talk about trauma without talking about grief. And I'm finally now at this place in my life where I have the words to put on these experiences. I have the labels, I have the concepts. But it's truly kind of fascinating, how immigration is this monumental life change, so to speak. And there's really not a lot of focus on it, not a whole ton of conversations going on in our country about the immigration experience. And it is very much one that, there is some invalidation that I think happens, just kind of speaking personally. um, it, there, my family immigrated here on a diversity visa, meaning that the United States was giving away visas for people in other countries in hopes of diversifying United States and bringing in people from other cultures to kind of expand like the talents and the culture. Um, so it's made out to be as this like beautiful thing, like, come, we welcome you here. And then people come here from other countries and they're kind of shunned for their differences. They realize that their differences aren't going to be celebrated, and instead those differences are going to cause them to be isolated and even oppressed.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I talk a lot about in doing trauma work with people, big T traumas and little T traumas. And I think moving across the ocean can be a big T trauma. I think like all these little traumas then of trying to fit in and not being allowed to, or feeling like you need to dampen your heritage or your ethnicity so that you can fit in, like all these little T traumas that can also accumulate with probably the more dramatic, sensationalized things we think about as on TV shows or in movies. These things are depicted of like, yeah, there's those big T traumas and then probably a host of little T traumas. And you're saying grief being a part of that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And big T trauma, little T trauma, it's all trauma, right? It affects us very similarly. So
Yes.
but yeah, and I think also when we talk about trauma, we so often focus on the things that happened, the things that are memorable in our life. So, the abuse or the natural disasters, or these things, that these events. What I really like to focus on in my private practice and in my work with clients is the traumas that fall under the category of things that didn't happen. Um,
Hmm.
so that's neglect, that's things that were kind of supposed to happen but never really happened, and how those things shaped our development, and how those things continue to show up in our adult lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And doing this work now is also, I imagine, like a lot of re-traumatizing or triggering, because immigration is such a highly politicized topic for a lot of folks who don't know what they're talking about related to the topic. And so for folks who have gone through the process to hear all the vitriol on the news and to hear some of these culture wars being fought for, I would say, performative politics,
Mm.
um, I imagine that you see that often in your work too, of like these triggers that are being hit and almost this pressure again to like conform and fit in because you don't want to stick out when it's such a hot topic.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Our country does kind of force us to conform for our own safety, for our own survival. But when we conform, we also have to abandon, like I said, that authenticity. And when we abandon parts of ourselves, we suppress them, right? We kind of pretend they're not there.
Hmm.
Um, but they're still very much living in our bodies and our minds and our thoughts and actions. But that's one of the pieces of grief that I feel like I'm personally still grappling with. Asking myself questions like, when I was 9 years old, instead of fully rejecting my Polish identity to fit in with my American peers, what would it have been like if I embraced my Polish identity and I kind of stuck with it, right? If I continued to listen to Polish artists or continued to bring Polish food to school, it and maybe that's just kind of my magical thinking, but it there are a lot of what ifs that I think accompany grief.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's I talk with clients a lot, and I work with religious trauma, so like a lot of that idea of like ignoring yourself or your authentic self to fit in is there in a lot of high control religions. And so this point of when you're safe, when you get to a place where your brain can like complete some of those developmental tasks that you look back and go, why didn't I do that then? But I think it's missing that piece of like, well, if you didn't feel safe, then it made sense to not do some of those things. But
Yeah.
like you're talking about bringing in the grief piece then of like kind of mourning that opportunity wasn't provided, or um, not being given the skills and tools or the support that you needed to be able to do that. Like it's so hard to look at this stuff in a vacuum of like this one individual could have done this thing differently.
Yeah. Yeah, and I often talk about my cultural identity as feeling very in between, because as I was growing up in the United States, my family were pretty set in their Polish identity, but my development um, was already embedded in the American culture. I was navigating all of these American values and uh, American standards, American norms that my family just didn't have the same exposure to. So I always felt like with my American friends, with my peers, I was just a little bit too Polish for them. I was just a little bit too different. And then with my family, over the years, I was too American. They didn't understand my American references or what we were doing in class or some of the subjects I was studying. They just didn't really have a template for it. So I was really straddling this world on my own, um, and that felt very isolating. And
Hmm.
um, you know, as I continued to develop my American identity, I very quickly surpassed my family. So because I now had more knowledge on the American culture, I was speaking the language. Um, they became very dependent on me, and I grew up quickly, or I was
Yeah.
very mature for my age because I was parentified. I was put
Hmm.
into an adult role very quickly, where my mom would attend student parent teacher conferences, and I was the one translating the
Yeah.
feedback my teachers were giving my mom. It, that's just one example, but making appointments for my family, and my family asking me, well, what is this in the grocery store? Well, what does this sign say? So it just put a lot of pressure on me to be more than I think I was ready to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and we talk about parentification. That's like a jargony psychology word, but I think looking at it from this immigration lens of almost like out of necessity, like as someone who can speak the language or read the language fluently, that just gives you access to things that you need to survive. That for people who are um, native speakers, we don't think twice about that stuff. And so great that America's offering these visas, but then the support on the back end to give people the skills and the things they need to actually succeed, I'm guessing wasn't great back in the day and still is quite lacking from what I hear now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think adults have a very different experience with immigration because they are the ones making the choice.
Hmm.
Regardless of their reasoning, they are the ones that have the autonomy to make that decision, whereas kids just kind of go along with it, right? They don't really get a say. They don't have much choice over the matter. And that's one of the hallmarks of trauma too, right? Feeling like your voice is being lost and that choice is being taken away from you. And I think adults have the ability to kind of imagine and pre-plan and have a different sort of community that they can go into once they immigrate to another country, whereas for kids, they're just kind of plopped into the school that's in their neighborhood, right? Whether
Right.
there's services, whether there's people speaking their language, it doesn't really matter. It's just like this is your designated school.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't mind me asking, did you move to a place that had a Polish community already set? Like, I'm in Milwaukee, there's a huge Polish community here. So, like, were you in a place where there was that or not really?
Yeah, so we moved directly to Chicago, which has the second largest population of Polish people next to Warsaw.
Hmm.
So, yes, a lot of Polish people. And there were actually two Polish speaking girls in my class, which sounds like a relief, but unfortunately, speaking a foreign language was not cool. Uh, so they didn't really interact with me. They weren't really available to translate or to teach me. Not that it was, their responsibility by any means, but I think that was also a pain that I carried throughout my
Hmm.
childhood and school age. Like these girls speak my language, but they won't. Like why won't they just help me? Um, so that was a big frustration. Like even if that help is available, it's not always accessible.
Yeah. Yeah. And all those intersecting messages that are probably going on for them to fit in as well. And these unspoken messages then. Yeah, there's a lot for a developing brain to make sense of in those situations. Um, I'm curious what the grad school kind of undergrad into grad school, like was immigration at the forefront of your mind? Like this is the thing I want to study, this is the thing I want to work on. Was this those internships kind of shaped you, or were you kind of finding your way into what it was going to look like once you got into your career?
Yeah, I kind of entered the psych field super eager, super excited. I wanted to dip my toes into every possible setting, every possible population, every possible theoretical intervention. I was just so excited, and I was trying to figure out what really truly clicked for me. And I knew I couldn't do that without uncovering what this field was all about. So I've worked in some therapeutic day schools. I've worked in an inpatient psych hospital. I've worked in a prison, a jail, on and on. And I think while I loved all those settings, I think the part that really resonated with me was trauma. uh, Seeing that was the common denominator, right? Going from like some really fancy treatment programs to also, working in a prison system, very different populations, but
Yeah.
so much pain, so much emotional pain that people were holding on to that was kind of showing up in these maladaptive behaviors and relationship struggles. And I also, because of my cultural identity, I've always been one to explore other people's cultural identities with them. And I think sometimes people are quick to say, well, I'm just American. I don't really have a culture. Um, and that's not true, because it's kind of that metaphor of like when a fish is swimming in water, it doesn't know it's in water, but it's
Mhm.
still in water. So I really encourage my clients, or people that I work with, and other kind of frameworks, to really stop and think about, like, where are your ancestors from? Where is your family of origin from? Like, even if it's thousands of years ago, I'm a big believer that um, generational trauma is a thing, and we are impacted by the things that our ancestors went through, even if we can't fully pinpoint it, or put our finger on it. We are the people that we are because of the past.
Yeah, and I think when you're raised in a privileged status, you don't have to think about that, and so a lot of people just don't. Like it's like you said, that fish in water, not being aware that it's surrounded by water. Like that's very much a privileged status where you're not having to confront it because it felt natural, or you fit in from the beginning, and so that made a ton of sense. Um, which yeah, I think like. I'm chuckling a little bit thinking about the internship placements you had, because that's what I talk to therapists about all the time. And similar story, homeless shelters, all these things. When we're in training, we work in these super high intensity settings. And what do you see in those high intensity settings? You see a lot of trauma. And so learning, like, what does that look like? Seeing how some of it's systemic, some of it's intergenerational, like these things that happen 4 or 5 generations ago get coded in our DNA. Like we can track those differences. And so the ability to handle stress, the ability to use healthy coping skills, or to have maladaptive behaviors attached to it, like, right, some of that is going back before we were born, a couple generations.
Yeah. Yeah, it didn't start with us, right? There's very specific reasons as to why we gravitate towards certain things, why certain things resonate with us, why certain things feel like default setting. So I think I always compare therapy to detective work, and I say it's the practice of psychology. It is a lot of uncovering, and a lot of speculations, and really seeing what fits, really trying to um, put together our own puzzles, kind of piece by piece. And I think culture is oftentimes overlooked, especially by people where, like we said, it's not really on their forefront or on their radar. So I'm pretty direct with my clients regarding their culture and how it's affected them, what sort of like discrepancies they feel between their parents and themselves too, because there is not only this generational divide between ourselves and our parents, or the adults that raised us, um, but like I mentioned earlier, there is a cultural divide. So um, you know, my mom has a template of what things are supposed to be like in this world from her Polish sort of filter. Whereas for me, I have to wear this Polish filter as much as I can to kind of stay connected to her, and have that like mutual understanding. But I also have to have my American filter on, because this is the country that I live in. This is the country that I work in. So I'm always kind of code switching, another jargon word. But I've gotten so used to it, especially when I was younger. I have to be a certain way with my family. I have to be a certain way when I'm at school. Um, and I think the grief shows up in the sense that my family will never truly understand my work, my involvement in some of these professional organizations. I had a really hard time even explaining to my mom what a podcast is. um,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
so we don't really think about that, but it's um, it's a piece of me that I feel like is somewhat lost because I don't get to fully share that experience with my mom and my family members. They just don't get it. This isn't their world. So I think I grieve the ability to have that sort of relationship with my family.
Yeah. Yeah. And that code switching again, like depending on when we're picking some of that stuff, a lot of it is while our brain's also developing. And so like this young developing brain hitting puberty, some of this stuff gets locked in where it feels very natural, but then we reflect on it and it's almost a trauma response of like the survival mode worked really well then, and later in life it might be maladaptive, and being able to kind of untangle why it worked in one setting and why it's not working in another.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm finally at this point in in my life and in my own therapy work where everything for the most part has been settled and kind of untangled, and now I'm starting to dive into my immigration experience, and also, some of the grief that I never got to address as a child because the pressure to be American was great. And there wasn't a whole lot of space or opportunity to talk about being Polish or my traditions or what I missed about my country, because sadly, a lot of their responses, well, are you not proud to be American? Or, well, why don't you go back to your country then? And it's just, um, it doesn't get you very far. So I'm really hopeful and optimistic that there becomes more of an embrace of people's uniqueness and the special things that they bring from other countries, because that's how it was designed to be.
Yeah.
That's what America is all about.
Yes, the mythical melting pot. Um, well, I think too, I've talked about this with some of the other guests on the podcast, like decolonizing mental health, like acknowledging that the profession kind of has this medical model history that doesn't always fit the way the brain works, and has been run by straight white males for a long time. Our body of research that we draw from most often is based predominantly on white males as the subjects. And so working to like move away from that expert model of we know what's ailing you and can fix it, and to create space and hold space for people to know how to heal themselves if we can support them and help them have space to do that finally.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I recently read an article of sorts that talked about how we are excluding so many people from research studies on the simple fact that they don't speak English fluently.
Hmm.
And that's a huge, huge part of the population that we're missing. So who are all of these studies and research trials and medication trials based off of? Because they're not fully representative of the people who are utilizing services, medications, treatment models. So it's not really fitting. And I'm a huge proponent of kind of changing our language from, like, what is wrong with you, right? What's wrong with your brain? What medication can fix this, to shifting it to what happened to you?
Hmm.
What what was the trajectory that kind of led you to where you are now? Um and providing so much psychoeducation on what trauma even is. And sometimes I avoid that word altogether because people are so resistant, right? I didn't have
Yeah.
any trauma. I was fine when I was a child.
Yeah. That's why I use big T, little t, because a lot of people I think of that PTSD, capital T, going to war, getting mugged, being in a car accident, and not understanding that trauma is anytime your brain doesn't complete the stress response cycle. And so, yeah, I find that resistance too of a lot of people don't like that word, even if that's very much what they're experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah. Besides the big T, little t, have you found any other words to describe trauma?
Well, and as working with religious trauma, I think like a lot of people assume I wasn't molested by a minister, I wasn't excommunicated, or like these big, again, these kind of dramatic, sweeping things. And so I really couch it in like those terms of safety of like, were you allowed to feel safe? Talking about autonomy a lot. Were you allowed to make your own decisions? Did you have space to do that? Could you speak up? Um, and I think that for a lot of people hits home, and we kind of go from there. I try no, I'm still working on this because I try really hard not to label people's experiences for them, but balancing that psychoeducation piece of like, my experience tells me this is a trauma response, trying to meet clients where they're at if that trauma word is a bit overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. I often say that things were and I use the term wound, and I like to do the analogy of a medical injury because it
Hmm.
really is not that much different, right? And sometimes we break a finger and we don't necessarily address it, and it heals wrong, or we have an infection and we put a band-aid over it and maybe it's fine, but then weeks, months down the road, that infection comes back up. And sometimes in order to heal it, we do have to dig around and we have to get a little messy and it hurts and it doesn't feel good. But we have to get that infection kind of
Yeah.
out, and we have to address it properly and give it some love and care and attention. So yeah, um, immigration has a lot of those little
Yeah.
wounds.
And I was going to do this at the end, but I think it makes sense to do this now. You wrote a chapter for a book talking about grief from kind of these different perspectives, and looking at the immigration piece of what grief comes along with that. Can you want to talk a little bit about the book?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is called The Grief Experience, and it's such a wonderful and inspirational book. And I know I'm biased, but it's 25 different authors that are discussing their personal and professional experiences with grief and different types of grief. So I wrote my chapter specifically focusing on ambiguous grief and disenfranchised grief, and how that relates to immigration, the grief of having to abandon my authenticity, the grief of growing up too fast and not really having a chance to be a kid, um, and also recognizing that grief isn't just reserved for the death of a person. And while that may be the most painful and truly heartbreaking grief, there are other losses that we experience that have a very similar effect on our bodies, our hearts, our minds, and we just need to get better at normalizing it, and giving people the love and support that we give when someone passes away.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I alluded to when we started talking is working with animals, but I don't remember if it was a blog post or a social media post, but talking about animal loss and like how that's one of those griefs that society is weird about, even though most of us would acknowledge that our pets are part of our family. for whatever reason, on a social level, that's not always how the grief is treated.
Yeah, and I think the connection with animals that I have stems from this need of wanting unconditional love. I feel like all throughout my life, I was faced with so many instances where I was othered, or I wasn't good enough, or I had these disadvantages, such as not knowing the language. But animals don't care. You can connect with them on such a deeper level, and I think it's really beautiful that we don't always have to. And there's my cat. They know.
They
They
do. They can
know.
sense it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it all, is kind of coming full circle that a lot of immigrants feel misunderstood, especially by the American culture. They feel like they don't have a voice, they don't speak the language. But animal love is kind of the same in every country, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, looking at it from a trauma lens, we have all this body of research that says combat veterans do really well with emotional support animals and service animals. And like starting to slowly, the field is very slowly starting to expand some of that research out a little bit to look at, okay, well, there's obviously more trauma than just combat veterans. Like,
Mhm.
what else does the science tell us about how people respond to these service animals? And it's overwhelmingly good. Like, even when I was in higher ed, we had two comfort dogs on campus, and just watching the stress during midterms or finals drop when you walk into a room with one of the dogs is like incredible. So I think it's exciting to think in terms of how that field can start to expand and the scientific community can start to branch out on our research with that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think still to this day, the mental health community is still very hesitant about emotional support animals and writing the letters. I feel, managed care probably has something to do with it. But we're very hesitant, I think, to propose alternative treatments that don't have to do with medication.
Hmm.
And I think, and maybe it's a conspiracy theory, that there is kind of this fear factor regarding therapists writing emotional support animal letters, whether it's a liability or a fear that the therapist is going to be held responsible for something. But that's also a huge misconception. And when you really get down to the nitty gritty of the Fair Housing Act, it, those things are written in such a way that explain that a person just has to have a diagnosable mental health condition to be eligible for an animal that
Hmm.
provides them support. So um, yeah, I'm a huge proponent, huge advocate for animals in both the therapeutic space, but also for emotional healing.
Yeah, yeah, and listening to you talk about it just brought. I wrote a blog post about when my dog, who's very much my dog, the dog I always wanted, it's this Great Dane mix, just this bundle of love. And like as I was deconstructing this high control religion, I just kept thinking like, right, but Izzy love like Izzy is unconditional love, like not the Bible. My dog who loves everyone all the time, no matter what they do, that's the idea of it. And so yeah, I tend to be really big on it too, and not just, I mean, service animal has a specific legal meaning, but emotional support animal, especially from a housing perspective, those aren't, we're not flying with them, we're not taking them everywhere we go, we're having them in our safe space with us so that we can decompress in a safe way. And service animals are incredible, some of the things they're able to do now. But emotional support animals, I've written letters for rabbits, guinea pigs, horses. Like
Mhm.
animals are so attuned to our emotional kind of environment. So I think, yeah, I'm with you on that. Like it's really this thing that is healing for a lot of people that we're limiting for not a particularly good reason.
Yeah, yeah. Emotional support animals, service animals, and also therapy animals, right? being able to bring animals into facilities that don't really have access to animals on a consistent basis, like hospitals, prison system. Those are the people that I think sometimes benefit the most, because they're done talking, right? They're talking, and they're expected to talk all day long sometimes about what their issues are. But as we know, a lot of that pain just lives in our bodies and can't be fully expressed verbally. And I think that's sometimes where animals bridge the gap.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned having a rescue dog. I have several as well. Like, I love the analogy, the metaphor they use too, of how we have grace for these creatures that were potentially traumatized or didn't get their needs met, but then we as humans kind of like compare ourselves differently or have different standards. And so I love the metaphor space as well for like, right, but you wouldn't treat your animal that way. Why are you treating yourself that way?
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many like beautiful things that animals can explain, or can kind of do to shift our own perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Gabby, this has been awesome. There's so much we could do, 3 more hours on these topics because, like you said, I think it's one of those things that a lot of folks don't have much awareness on. But if people want to learn more about the work you're doing, your practice, if they want to check that out, where can they go to find you?
Yeah, so my practice is called Mini Mental Health Services. I do have an Instagram that's pretty active, but I'm also available by text, by email, calling, but I'm a millennial, so I don't love the phone calls.
Right?
But
Yes.
I'm always looking to connect with people, whether it's for professional services, but also to just be like, hey, I relate. I've been there. Um, and I am also SIPAC certified, which means that I can practice in almost all of the 50 states.
Yeah. Yeah, which is awesome. And another way that we've slowly taken longer than it should have, but started to remove barriers for people working with someone who would be a good fit for them.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, your Instagram's awesome. We'll link to your website and Instagram, and the book came out recently.
Yeah, the book
Book's
came
out.
out. Yeah, it's available on Amazon.
Yeah,
So if anyone is looking for some reading that would be both healing and inspirational, please check it out.
yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes as well. I love those written from all these different voices, these different perspectives, pulling in people with unique voices. So we'll have those links too. Gabby,
Cool.
this has been awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And to all the wonderful listeners out there, thanks again for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.